On behalf of the Jefferson Educational Society, its president, Dr. Furki Farhadi, and chair of the Board of Trustees, Dr. Bahur Ghosheh, I welcome you to tonight's Global Summit 16 event, featuring best-selling author and acclaimed historian Heather Cox Richardson and best-selling Atlantic magazine author Tom Nichols. Their reputations apparently preceded them because demand for tickets for tonight's event has been so high that we've had to relocate it not once, but twice. And actually, justly so. I've been lobbying the JES to bring Heather Cox Richardson to Erie for several years. Her daily newsletter, and I'm guessing that many of you in the audience read it, her daily newsletter, Letters... I thought that was a pretty safe guess. Her daily newsletter, Letters from an American, and her many books are among the most insightful observations on the history behind the current state of American democracy. Nichols, Tom recently wrote two superb pieces for The Atlantic, in particular about one of my heroes, George Washington, with laser insight into the importance of this year's presidential election. I can't recommend Richardson and Nichols' insights highly enough. I'm Andrew Roth. I serve on the JES Board of Trustees. I'm also a scholar in residence at the JES and help with its Brock Institute for Mega Issues, begun by my friend, the late Reverend Charles Brock. I know Charlie, whose spirit remains very present in the JES's work. I know Charles would have been absolutely thrilled about tonight's event. He was dedicated. Actually, one of the projects he was literally working on at the last minutes of his life, literally working on, was how to preserve America's great experiment in government of the people, by the people, for the people. And I know he'd be thrilled that the Jefferson has brought to Erie such stalwart defenders of American democracy as Heather Cox Richardson and Tom Nichols. Tonight's event marks number 5 in Global Summit 16's more than a dozen. Tomorrow, we are proud to again partner with Gannon University by including the Gannon Reads program in the Global Summit. It features Laura Schwartz discussing her much-praised book, Try to Love the Questions, From Debate to Dialogue in Classrooms and Life. For details about future events, including locations and time, go to our website, JES Erie, J-E-S-E-R-I-E, jeserie.org, or ask one of our team members tonight. But most importantly, none of this would be possible without you, so thank you for being here and for attending the many other events we host. The Global Summit would also not be possible without the continued and generous support of community organizations, our sponsors, from Lacom Health to Erie Insurance to Logistics Plus to PNC to Lincoln Recycling and many, many, many others, including Sarah McWilliams, who strongly encouraged us to bring Tom Nichols last year and strongly urged us to bring him back with Heather Cox Richardson. The JES team excels at starting and continue. It's easy to start things. It's hard to continue things. The JES team excels at starting and continuing conversations. That is evident not only in the quality of its programming, but also by its sustained partnerships with sponsors over the years, including 2 of tonight's, Erie News Now and Gannon University. To offer a few words on behalf of Erie News Now, followed by the official introduction of tonight's guest by Gannon University President Dr. Walter Iwanenko, I'd like to introduce Lisa Adams, the host of Erie News Now's The Insider, she recently featured a sit-down interview with former U.S. Representative Liz Cheney, who kicked off the Global Summit just a week ago, well, a little more than a week ago, on October 17th in this room with the largest audience ever to attend any event at the convention center.
Lisa?
Thank you. You're 1/3 of the way through the introductions. Global Summit 16 comes at an unprecedented moment in our national politics. Assassination attempts, Republicans campaigning for Democrats, fires set in ballot boxes, people eating cats and dogs. You might say we're witnessing a civil war of words in this presidential election. You all feel it, and I think you can imagine how it is intensified for those of us who work in local broadcast news. We face a daily onslaught of campaign visits, surrogate stops, Zoom interview offers, but I have to say at Erie News Now, we remain unabashedly committed to covering it all with balance and objectivity. I sat in this room listening to Liz Cheney speak at the Global Summit's opening after having that privilege of a sit-down interview with her face-to-face, which you can still watch at erienewsnow.com. But as an audience member and a news person, I'm so objective I was struggling with when to clap or not clap. In other words, what was generally a good statement for all humankind, I was clapping. If I felt that she was making a partisan statement, I thought I better not clap because I don't want to be seen as having an opinion. Because our management at Erie News Now is so committed to the fair and meaningful exchange of ideas and educating our viewers, we have been a very proud media supporter of the Jefferson Educational Society's Global Summit from the very start. And I know you are in for another amazing program tonight with American historian and nightly newsletter writer Heather Cox Richardson, who, by the way, has a literary agent named Lisa Adams, who I met tonight. Very cool. And scholar, national security expert, and author Tom Nichols. On behalf of Erie News Now, our entire team is really proud to welcome all of you here tonight, and thank you for being a part of this very meaningful summit year after year. Our community, as you've been hearing, is a bellwether of thinkers like you who listen, weigh ideas, policy, and talk civilly with others. May that continue through this turbulent election season and beyond. Erie News Now will certainly be there to track it all for you. Again, welcome here tonight. And now, the president of Gannon University, Dr. Walter Iwanenko.
Well, good evening. And thank you, Lisa. Can we get another round of applause? Let's thank the Jefferson Education Society, their staff, and the staff of this beautiful facility for putting on this event this evening. It's fantastic. As president of Gannon University, I am thrilled to see you all here this evening for this exciting event, and we are really proud to partner with the Jefferson Educational Society to support the Global Summit and the Speaker Series. We value the mission, and the mission to bring such globally important programs to this community. It helps us deepen our understanding and broaden our perspectives, and I think we could all agree we need a little bit of more of that right now. So thank you for all your work. What makes us extremely proud as well is that many of our students, our faculty, our staff can participate, and even more importantly, our community members can take advantage of this opportunity. Give yourself a round of applause for making it out here this evening. In order to be global citizens, we have to be citizens, and we have to be informed citizens. As we strive to become more informed citizens, we recognize that there is an immense value in examining our past to solidify our understanding of the present, and it gives us a way better idea of where we are headed in the future. It is now my pleasure to welcome two amazing speakers to help us shape these perspectives. Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She has written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the American West in award-winning books whose subjects stretch from the European settlement of North America to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. She is the author, most recently, of the best-selling Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America. Jane Mayer has called the book a vibrant and essential history of America's unending, enraging, and utterly compelling struggle since its founding to live up to its own best ideals. Heather Richardson's work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, among other outlets. Her nightly newsletter, Letters from an American, reaches more than 1 million readers. Tom Nichols is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he pens the Atlantic Daily newsletter, guiding readers through the biggest news, ideas, and cultural happenings of the day. He writes about international security, nuclear weapons, Russia, and the challenges to democracy in the United States and around the world. He is the best-selling author of books examining the decline of society and the fall of democracy, including The Death of Expertise, Our Own Worst Enemy, and The Death of Expertise, the second edition, which was released this past April. Tom Nichols is a professor emeritus of the National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and a former instructor at the Harvard Extension School. He is a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion and was once listed as one of the top 100 players of the game. Please join me in giving a warm, eerie, 76-degree, October 29th, eerie, warm welcome to Heather and Tom as they share their perspectives.
Oh, thanks. I've each got Diet Cokes. So I am going to speak for Tom to start, although he may want to add to it, to say great thanks to JES for having us. It is a real joy to be here. I had never been to Erie before, and I'm telling you, I'm coming back.
After my last visit with you, I couldn't wait to come back, and that's why I wanted to make sure to bring Heather with me this time and to have us both here, because this is such a great place to be, so thank you.
I'm here because he wouldn't say no, or he wouldn't let me say no, and it seems like it's pretty good timing for us to chat. Is anything going on?
Something happening soon?
So let's start with a gut check. Where are you? We got a week until, never mind.
When I'm not, paralyzed and staring at the ceiling. I am of two minds. So I have a gut check and a head check. My head says, as of this morning, because things are moving so quickly, and I mean really quickly. I mean, I could not have guessed 24 hours ago, for example, that one of the candidates would alienate an entire Hispanic constituency. So, didn't predict that one. But as of this morning, I feel like things are going in the right direction. That if I were on the Harris campaign, I would say, yeah, okay, the numbers. On the other hand, experience, and as many of you know, I am, in my misspent youth, I was a Republican. I'm a former Republican. So I know from watching Republican races that a 2-point lead for a Democrat is not enough because of turnout issues. And for a Democrat to prevail over the higher turnout, loyal turnout Republicans, it's got to be, this time in 2020, Biden was ahead 5 or 6 in every swing state. So my head says it looks right. My heart says my heart says don't. My heart takes an old Russian proverb: "Hope dies last." So I'm trying not to be overly hopeful because it's just too tight for my feeling. How about you?
So I am going to say something similar but different in the sense that I think there is a movement underway in this country. I think it is not accurately reflected in the way that legacy media is covering this election. I think that, well, and this may say something, right? I feel like there have been a number of people who have been organizing really, really seriously now for many years. This is not something that's happened just since President Joe Biden decided not to accept the Democratic nomination for president. And I was thinking about this. I don't know how you take what is happening in this country and stuff it back into a bottle. And so I am ignoring the polls and thinking, how do you take, for example, right now, there is a rally going on in the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., where Vice President Kamala Harris is giving her closing argument for the campaign. And the overflow is such that, there's a whole nother rally outside the rally. There are so many people there. And Trump's last rally was virtually empty. And I just don't know how you do that and stuff that back into a bottle. I just don't know how that's going to happen. But I would suggest that it would be interesting to hear from you about how this election might be different or the same 16, 20, 24. Because each of those elections had the same Republican candidate running, and yet I would think they're very different candidates, the same man but in very different incarnations and very different constituencies.
This gets back to the head and gut problem, right? Because you're a historian, I'm a political scientist, again in my previous career, but we both know that anybody who's a three-time taking their third shot at the presidency, I mean,
Except Grover Cleveland.
Except for Grover Cleveland.
I got to have my Grover.
Who of blessed memory, but
I feel like that was sarcastic. Do you feel like that was sarcastic?
There's a reason that we don't have a piece of money with President Adlai Stevenson on it either.
Yeah.
It's just not. I mean, by all the laws of political physics, he's done. I mean, this is now, you came in on that one a little too quick. Because also the indications are that he's going to get more votes this time around than he did in 2016. Now, I still think he's never going to win a majority because of the way this country
Ceiling
is
is 47.
Yeah. The problem is, and this is where, I start to seize up again, that, we've never had an election like this. On the other hand, we've also never had this kind of an electorate so efficiently distributed through 4 or 5 states. So, what is that? I mean, where do you see that?
What do you mean an electorate efficiently distributed through 3 or 4
that
states?
There are just enough people who are loyal to Trump, who are going to be unshakable Trump voters, and there are just enough of them in each swing state to make a difference. So, it's not like they're all in California, and, all of the Harris voters are in Texas, or in California, all the Trump voters are in Texas. That's true for 45 states. But it's not true for 4 or 5 states, where there are just enough folks who are going to make that margin. So even though he should be a 3-time, one-time winner squeaking through a loophole in the Electoral College, shouldn't be even close this time. But that structural problem of those 3 or 4 states is just giving me the willies.
All right, so structural problem, which I agree with you about, but how do you factor in, you just mentioned the Madison Square Garden debacle. How do you think Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health is going to fit in here?
That's a question I was going to ask you.
I got there first.
Because, it seems to me that it's epical. I think, Republicans, I'll let you in on a secret, for years they all said, we want to overturn Roe v. Wade.
But
and many of them said,
no, we don't.
that dog didn't want to catch that car. But what are you seeing among female voters? Because I feel like this is kind of opaque to me in a certain way about the energizing of certain constituencies about this. I've been kind of fascinated looking at the Republicans desperately trying to figure out how to parse this and get away from it. I don't know enough about the Democratic constituencies to know if this is, it feels to me like this is a make or break issue for a lot of Democrats.
Yeah, wouldn't you say? And I think that personally, I think that this is one of the reasons you're seeing white women breaking for the Democrats, which, you know, the white women have tended to vote with white men, and it's been the black women and Hispanic women who have tended to support the Democrats, and you're seeing that split here. You're also seeing older people go for the Democrats instead of the Republicans, and they are doing so, I think, in part because we want to pass on to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren the same rights that we had. But I would actually suggest that Dobbs has been really important in a different way as well. And that is, first of all, the recognition that this particular Supreme Court saw fit to take away a constitutional right that had been recognized for 49 years. That has never happened before. And so we don't know. We don't know how that's going to play out. But one of the things that I think that I have seen is the recognition on the part of a number of women that it really is our lives on the line. And the organizing that has happened out of the spotlight that, as I say, I don't think the legacy press has picked up, and that is not necessarily showing up in the polls, although ignore the polls, I think is going to mark this particular election as a real game changer election.
Related to that, and this is an interesting kind of speculative question. You asked about the difference between 2016 and now, right? 2016, we had the issue of the supposed shy Trump voter, and that polls weren't picking it up, legacy media weren't picking it up. They weren't. I mean, the old jokes about anybody with a landline isn't somebody you really want to talk to. But now there's a question about whether or not, because of Dobbs, we have a shy Harris voter who is primarily female and may be in a,
I'm laughing because you can hear the rumble.
Well, it's that.
I don't believe that, do you?
But that are in families, for example, where the husband may be a Trump voter, or they're in a Trump-heavy area, and so they're simply flying under the radar and saying that they're going to vote for Harris, but they're not telling pollsters, they're not talking about it as much, they're not accessible to the traditional media. I mean,
I think that's right. But who knows? I mean, we obviously don't know what's going to happen. But I don't think it is just Dobbs. I think that we are seeing a real revolution in the role of women in American politics in this particular election. We see an extraordinary gender gap, which started in 1980 in the Reagan election. That's when the gender gap really started. The gender gap this year, I don't even know where we're at now. Do you?
With the gender gap now?
Yeah.
By race, of course, it varies significantly.
Right.
But it's still, Trump is still running far ahead with men, and Harris is still running far ahead with women.
Right. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this election is, and I want to ask you about this, is the realignment of the political parties. And one of the things that jumps out to me is the degree to which the Democrats are really pushing the kind of community ideas that really people like Francis Perkins pioneered in the 1930s, with the idea that everybody is equally valuable in society as opposed to your value depends on how much money you make. And what's interesting to me is, of course, that's a view that reflects the reality in which we all live, but that certainly women know we live in. And it also, I think, has been picked up by the Harris-Walz campaign. So I think maybe some of the ways in which we have looked at politics in the past just don't obtain in this election.
Yeah,
I mean, you didn't mention 2020, which is another interesting one.
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason that the parties aren't behaving in the same way, and it pains me to say this as a again, I should probably explain my backstory. I was a New England Republican, Massachusetts. I worked for by the way, I have a Pennsylvania connection. I worked in Washington for the late Senator John Hines. A great man. A great man who probably would have been hounded out of the Republican Party by now, sadly. So, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s in that kind of very moderate Republican environment. I was not a movement conservative, so a lot of what happened took me by surprise. The problem is that the Republican Party now, and I say this both with grief and I think with analytical precision, is not a political party. It doesn't function like a political party. It doesn't, to use political science speak, it doesn't aggregate interests in the way that a political party does. It doesn't, bring together constituencies to express policy preferences. It's a cult of personality. It's a vehicle for one person who has, let's face it, Donald Trump has no interest in policy, couldn't care less about it, is running to stay out of jail, basically. And that party, we call it a party, but it's become a kind of mass movement around one person. And I think that the knock-on effect to the Democrats that Harris finally kind of figured out among the Democrats, and I have to say, I was deeply critical of Harris's 2019 campaign, but I have to say that I think this campaign's been flawless. And look, trust me, I'm the most honest critic you'll find because I was pretty hard on Kamala Harris in 2019. But I think that she and the Democrats that are running this campaign have figured out there's an opening here to be the party of everyone else.
That's right. That's right.
The party of people who, yes, care about some of the progressive ideas you talked about. It can also be the party of people who are just really sick of this guy. That's a challenge because that's an inherently unstable coalition, right? Any coalition that has you, me,
and Dick Cheney.
And Bernie Sanders, that's a pretty crowded station wagon.
So I want to get back to what you just said about it not functioning like a political party. But I'm going to give you a heads up here. One of the things that I really was hoping to talk with Tom about, two things. But one of them is that it certainly looks to me as if, and I'm happy to talk about this from my own perspective, that the Democrats have taken their own new direction to create this very large organization. And one of the things about that is people always say, well, I'm voting for Harris, but I'm a Republican. And I always kind of chuckle because people said the same thing when they voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. But by 1865, all those people who'd gone into that coalition in 1860, you couldn't tell how they were going to come out because the issues were all new. And one of the things that I literally sit up and play at night with is if you were writing what the political parties are going to look like, and I'll give you as far as 10 years, what do they look like?
Boy, I will say, because I spent most of my life with one party, I'll only talk about that one. I'll leave it to you to talk about the Democrats, but I think it all depends on what happens next week. And I know that's one of those, sounds like a facile.
Take us through both.
Well, if Trump wins, then and takes enough down ballot races up with him, the argument will be, see, this is the new party. It can win like a party. And the mistake of 2020 was not being Trumpy enough.
Right, but in fairness, the man has never had coattails to bring the lower things up. Never. He's never. It's one of the reasons that there's such a war going on right now in the Republican Party. Because there is a war going on in the Republican Party.
Well, if you count, Chris Sununu and Nikki Haley, preemptively surrendering as a war, but there is this sense there are Republicans hiding in the caves, so to speak, saying this has to end at some point. Now, if Trump wins, you're right, he doesn't have coattails. But again, anything could happen in these very close, very weird races. I'm pretty sure that he's not going to bring Kari Lake with him in Arizona.
So if Trump wins, do you Do you want me to ask him what he thinks he sees, or would we rather leave this to our imaginations?
That becomes the new Republican Party, and it becomes a kind of dynastic party that probably becomes a permanent, because Rick Wilson has a guy, I'm sure many of you have seen, Rick Wilson has a great line. He says, Trumpism doesn't scale. Only Trump can do Trump.
Right.
And he'll try and pass this along to Don or whoever, but you will get a kind of permanent but nonetheless persistent minority party that will basically gum up governing and conduct this culture war forever, at least for our purposes of another 10 years. If Trump loses, first, I think there will be violence. I think that's just he's prepping the ground for that right now. But I think that is when, Chris Sununu, before he bent the knee, said, we have to stop nominating kooks and crazy people. That argument is going to come back in force. And I think what happens, and here I will pass it over to you about the Democrats, I think that big unstable atom that we now call the Democratic Party fissions, and some center-right part of it becomes some other
Yes, but
party.
That's what I'm asking. What does it become? I mean, where is the fissure? I mean, I sit here and I say, if you have this big coalition against that, I figure climate change is going to be a major issue, that the parties are going to have to incorporate that into a new ideology. Foreign policy, though, if you're a Republican, where are you going to go with the Democrats having essentially taken over most of the principles, although on a very different scale?
That is a remarkable change, isn't it? I mean, I was an old, Reaganite, and I'm like, where is the most Reaganite Republican, where's the most Reaganite foreign policy in America right now? It was in Kamala Harris's acceptance speech.
Right.
Which was
is not the same as Biden's, yeah.
But I don't know what that, I mean, the Trump has poisoned all the structures of the Republican Party. I've been arguing for a few years, you basically have to burn down the RNC, metaphorically, because it's run by his family, it's become his personal piggy bank. It doesn't, if Kamala Harris wins, in part, again, it'll be because she ran a good campaign, but also because the RNC no longer functions like a get-out-the-vote organization, right? It doesn't do anything. And then you may have some kind of revolt, and it may be a revolt of the donors, because this is the one group we're not talking about. We talk about the grassroots, we're talking about the senior folks. The donors may say, I'm tired of giving lots of money and not getting anything, and just getting losses, again, Kari Lake and the guy here in Pennsylvania, the Senate candidate I can't think of. Eventually, one of the most interesting data points in my hopeful mode, Trump's small number donations have dried up. His small donor donations have dried up. His campaign now is almost entirely, well, I shouldn't say entirely, but heavily dependent now on big money donors. That's good for two reasons. It means that ordinary Americans are saying, I'm not writing this guy any checks anymore.
Well, also, if they've been bled dry.
And I don't know, there's still Trump coins and Trump Bibles, and there's still plenty of grift left, but you're right that at some point they're just not going to write another campaign check. But that also means that the big donors are saying, okay, I'm writing another check and I'm going to do this for millions of dollars, but I can't keep doing this and getting January 6th, because that doesn't get me anywhere in terms of what I want. And this is the big disconnect between Trump and a big part of the party, is that these donors, whether you love them or hate them or agree with them or not, there's certain things they want. Trump doesn't care about any of that. So I don't know what happens to that, but I think, one question I have for you is, how long do you think traditional Democrats are going to be able to maintain this coalition with, these Visigoths from my party that have shown up and said, brought our spears and our furs and said, well, we're here. Because I think this is I think one thing, regardless of which party we're talking about, 2024 is an unnatural situation right now. It's a strange, unstable situation.
But it reminds me of other unstable periods from which we got progressive eras. And so what we're talking about when I say there's a civil war in the Republican Party, what I am referring to is the fact you have the MAGAs who want to destroy the federal government, want to get rid of NATO, want to get rid of all the guardrails that we've had in place since World War II, and replace that, at least in the United States, with a strong government that will impose Christian nationalism. And they're not really isolationist, as Foreign Policy pointed out a couple days ago. They want to ally with other dictatorial, with authoritarian governments. So they're essentially talking about trashing American democracy and turning this country into an authoritarian government. And because it's the United States of America, that would last for a very long time. But the problem with that, even if you still maintain you're a Republican, and this is where I'm talking about the Civil War, is that if you are actually doing business with other countries, you know that if you lose the guardrails of democracy, if you lose the freedom of the seas, if you lose the financial guardrails, you can't do business. You can no longer do business. So even if you want lower taxes, and even if you want all the things that Trump has promised to do, I promise you nobody wants tariffs, and I'm happy to talk about tariffs until you all fall asleep in your chairs. But you've got an inherent contradiction there. Then this is, I think, why you see so many never-Trumpers. Aside from anything else, as you sit there and you say, no, we actually must keep the international guardrails that enable us to have tankers on the oceans, which we don't talk a lot about, but I promise you, if you're doing business in China, you know you want container ships to be able to cross through all the straits, right, like they can do now. So that's what's going on, I think, in the Republican Party. But then you've got this Democratic Party that is not simply a coalition opposed to that, although it certainly is that, but it's a party that absolutely fascinates me right now because, first of all, President Joe Biden very deliberately talked in a very famous speech, at least for people like us, on February 4th, 2021 at the State Department. He talked about how in order to protect democracy abroad, it had to be protected at home, and the way to protect it at home was to bring jobs back to the disaffected areas, like, around here. You've gotten 2,000 new jobs in Erie County in the last 3 years, and that was not by accident. He really decided that he was going to go out and make sure that we protected democracy by making it work for people. You had him doing that in a way that looked in many ways like FDR and like FDR's economic focus. But what Harris has done, what Vice President Harris has done, strikes me as being extraordinarily different. That is, first of all, she has run, not walked away from identity politics. Which it was notable. It was notable at the Democratic National Convention, where she didn't talk about being the first woman president. People wore white to honor the suffragists. She wore black. I don't know if you noticed that. She didn't talk about, her being the barrier breaking or any of those things. She talked about families, and she talked about communities, and she talked about how we all have so much in common. Presidential running mate Tim Walz, Minnesota governor, he stood up and did the same thing. They really focused on that, as I say, that idea of community. But what was interesting to me about that is she appears to have really walked away from the identity politics, and he is a real counterpoint to that, and I won't suggest this is why she picked him, but he really in many ways represents the old Republican progressivism of the Midwest. That idea that Teddy Roosevelt picked up from Wisconsin Governor Bob La Follette in the early progressive era. So you've got the Democrats kind of reshaping themselves, and you've got the people who dislike the current Republican nominee, and you have Republicans who are never Trumpers, and they are going to split. There's absolutely no doubt, because the same thing happened in the 1860s, and the parties split. They kept the same names, but they had completely different issues. The same thing happens in the 1880s. Really interesting moment where the Democrats do this. They run over the cliff to extremism. And the Republicans sort of pick up everything in 1880. And then in 1884, the Democrats say, we are done with the extremism. We're going with the urban voters. We get Grover Cleveland. I did that whole setup so I could talk about Grover Cleveland. We get Grover Cleveland.
I had no idea you were such a Grover Cleveland fan.
I have a story for you. And then he wins 3 elections in a row. That's a long story. But then Teddy Roosevelt picks up the same things he was doing, and we get the progressive era. And I look at where we are right now, and I see basically this almost growing pains or birth pains into a new era where we'll get 2 new parties, probably still called the Democratic and Republican parties, but it will be an entirely new party system, which is why I asked you what you think those issues will be. I'll give you climate change and foreign affairs, but if I were starting a new Republican Party right here, right now, I don't know what I'd put on it.
Well, for one thing, I'd put women back in it.
That would be a thought.
And I think, it almost sounded a little like triumphalism, except that I agree with you, to say, well, this could herald a new era of progressivism. I think that's what's going to happen, in part because the never-Trumpers and a lot of the Republican defectors who are not, I'm an OG never-Trumper. I started in 2015. I was out there. But a lot of folks who have just come to you don't want to call them never-Trumpers, I'm tired of this guy Trumpers. I can't do this anymore, Republicans. I think that having to break with the hard right, Christian nationalist, old school, old isolationist, it did make us, and we get accused of this, by the way, by right-wing Republicans. You guys have become more liberal. Yeah. You know
who I see it in? Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol was on Twitter the other day, and he said, I hate to go out of line here, but it seems to me that white men are the problem. And I'm like, I need new glasses,
One of the best tweets Bill Kristol ever put out there, he said, this whole thing is bringing out my inner socialist. And that's, I suppose that comes a little more naturally to me because I was one of these New England squish, when I joined the Republican Party, Ed Brooke was a senator, right? Black Republican, moderate senator, so I was always suspect among hardcore Republicans. But I think a lot more Republicans are getting to the point where they're saying, yeah, I have a daughter. I don't want her to die if she needs medical care. That people who felt like they had the space to take harder moral stances, say, well, I don't think birth control should be, on demand without apologies form, or abortion should be birth control. That was easy to say until then the people in your coalition said, that's right, there shouldn't be any of that. No abortion, no birth control, no 19th Amendment, no, put women in the kitchen. All this. It's like, whoa, okay, maybe I am more liberal than I thought. I used to say that I felt like the Republicans, I threw a lot of hard elbows. I said a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have, but I always thought of us as being that the Constitution was a big bouncy house. Right? Like kids, right? Kids go to those inflatable houses, and we all go in there and jump around and push each other down, but we're not really going to get hurt because the Constitution is around us and protects us. I don't have that faith anymore. I feel like we are pioneering a period that goes back to the late 18th and early 19th century where we really have to defend the Constitution as a thing that protects us and that we have to protect in turn. And I wanted to believe that everybody in the bouncy house understood those rules until people came in with ice picks and started, blowing up and letting the air out of the whole thing. So I think you're right that that even if Trump wins, even if there is this kind of lurch to the right, it's not going to last for 2 reasons. First of all, because a lot of people who once thought they were very conservative, turns out they're not that conservative. Like I said, we have daughters. We like other countries. We think NATO is good. I never thought I would have to say, hey, fellow Republicans, now I'm a former, but hey, Republicans, NATO is good. When I was a grad student at Georgetown, I was a teaching assistant to two people at the same time, Madeleine Albright and Jeane Kirkpatrick. Which you can imagine was pretty cool. But I could not imagine them disagreeing. Like I couldn't imagine them passing in the hall and one saying, go NATO, and the other hissing, They were sensible people. And I think that's going to come back because the second reason that I was going to bring up is, and you've been getting at this, Heather, it's unsustainable. You can't live in a world where tankers can't get through the straits. You just can't. And I've tried, and I think one thing that we should all try to do if you care about foreign policy, which does not usually move elections, is to tell people your standard of living, the kitchen table issues that you care about are directly affected by the ability to move freely about the world. You know, you travel. Yeah. If you want to go see your aunt in Italy, your passport works because of agreements we've made. You know, I try to explain to people, right now you live in a world governed by the Washington and Brussels rules. Okay, the Pax Americana, but also the Pax, you know, the Pax Americana that spreads to Europe. The European Union, NATO, Brussels, Washington. I tell people, you don't want to live in a world where Moscow and Beijing make the rules. You don't. And if you want to get across to someone when you're having this discussion about what that would look like, this is what it would look like. Imagine the supply chain disruptions that made us miserable during the pandemic happening at any moment because China feels like it, because we've annoyed them, or because there's something they don't like. And suddenly the kinds of deprivations and inflationary pressures and shortages that you lived under during the pandemic become manufactured by a foreign power just because they can. And people don't understand this can happen because they are so used to an America that is supremely powerful, to an American economy that is supremely dominant, that they almost can't imagine the world in which that doesn't happen anymore. Now, I still think it would be short term, because I think if Trump got his way, tariffs, I'll open the door for you to talk about tariffs. If Trump puts those tariffs through, if he crashes the economy, if Robert Kennedy runs the Department of Health, well, I mean, we laugh, but he said Trump's going to make him the health czar, right, and people will die.
Right.
So, that misery will eventually snap back. And the only question is, how much damage and how unrecoverable is that damage before that new coalition that you're talking about finally forms?
Yeah, I don't feel good about the amount of damage that can be done in a very short time, especially with climate change hanging over our heads.
Well, and especially this time, because this time there will be no adults in the room.
Right.
This time, he's going to turn to, I mean, I don't know if it'll be, Bannon might be back in jail in New York, but he's going to turn to, Kash Patel, or some of these other kinds of stooges that he's going to bring with him. There's not going to be a Jim Mattis. I mean, literally, he calls up Mattis at one point and says, "I'm going to kill," I think it was a site, "I'm going to kill," and Mattis goes, "Yes, sir, get right on that," and then hangs up the phone and goes, "We're not doing that." Now, that's bad. You don't want the Secretary of Defense basically hanging up the phone and saying, "I don't listen to the president." On the other hand, when Trump is off his rocker, a lot of people did that and basically just said, "I don't remember that phone call," No one's going to be there to do that this time. So the amount of damage that could be done could be immense and fast.
So we need to go to questions, but I'm going to take the advantage of sitting here next to you. I've got a whole lot of questions for you. But the one thing, I said there were two things I wanted to ask you about. One was the political parties, but two, talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the importance of the fact that the military leaders are coming out to speak against Trump. This is a really big deal, and people seem to act, I think, and people are seeming to act as if it's like, oh, look, somebody else said something nasty about Trump.
I taught for 25 years at the U.S. Naval War College, which is a senior military academy. My students over those years were everything from Navy lieutenants and Army captains all the way up to captains and colonels. And I am deeply concerned about the damage that Trump has done and is doing and will do to American civil-military relations. George Washington, whom some of you know I recently wrote about, blessed us with a tradition of military non-interference in civilian politics. For these 4-star officers to come out and say, yes, I said that this former president, I mean, look, generals have, since the 70s, I would say, and 80s, I mean, one of the first ones to really do it was Admiral Crowe, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs back in the 80s and 90s. It was considered unusual, but it was like, well, instead of bad-mouthing somebody, they'd say, well, I just think Bill Clinton's awesome, you know, a good guy. To have 4-star officers come out and say, the former president that I worked for is a fascist, should terrify all of you for several reasons. It should terrify all of you for several reasons. First of all, because apparently the former president is a fascist.
That's right.
Or an aspiring fascist, we might say. But also that he was so concerning to them that they have broken with an immense and long-standing tradition to speak up and to talk about how much in danger we are. The other part of it that I think they're worried about, and I am surmising this. I have not interviewed John Kelly or Jim Mattis or anybody else. I'm just, from my years of experience with military officers, I think they are deeply concerned about what Trump is trying to do to the American Officer Corps, which is that he wants to turn it into a Praetorian Guard around him.
Right, that's right.
He thinks loyalty to the Constitution is for suckers. Loyalty to him is the only thing that matters. Now, let me leave you on some hope here before we take your questions. The men and women that I've had the honor to know who serve our country are patriots who understand their constitutional duty. They will refuse illegal orders. See, I sucked you in by saying something happy, and now I've got to be really negative. But all Trump needs is a handful of very bad people at the very top of the Defense Department because then what they'll do is they'll rely on obedience to the chain of command to get a lot of things done. And they will issue things that are facially legal orders, but with bad intent. So for example, instead of saying, let's send the army in to shoot all these protesters, which would be an illegal order, right? Say, you know what, as Commander-in-Chief, I'm going to redeploy the Virginia National Guard, and I'm going to redeploy them around, Georgetown University today, just for an exercise. Don't be scared. Maybe I'll deploy them around polling stations. Maybe I'll put them, maybe I'll have a parade through a black neighborhood. I don't know. You can do all kinds of things that are legal and intimidating and scary if you have people. He has said he wants to bring General Flynn back into the government. Now imagine that. So I'm really worried that he is going to try and politicize the military, and he will create a civil military crisis by taking a few of his goons, putting them in at the top, who will then try to issue orders that other ranks are going to say, I can't fulfill that order. And also remember one other thing, and I'm sorry if you're not going to sleep well after I say this. The President of the United States has the sole and unlimited authority to use nuclear weapons. There is no countermanding him. The system is not designed to stop him. It is designed to enable him. And the only thing that could stop him is if someone at Strategic Command basically said, I'm not going to do that. Now, he can then say, you're fired. Put your deputy on the phone. This system was not designed to prevent presidents from using either conventional or nuclear force. Our military system in the 21st century is an artifact of the Cold War. It's there to enable a president to use military force and nuclear weapons fast. So I will just leave you with that. Maybe we should get to some cheery questions. This is right at the top of the pile, and I thought this was so interesting. Sue asked, have we had the October surprise yet? I feel like every day is an October surprise.
Yeah, I said that the October surprise was that the Republican nominee's brain is tapioca and nobody is stopping him, which is an indictment not of him necessarily, but of the people who continue to enable him. But The Madison Square Garden rally was an extraordinary event, historically, politically, and for that campaign. I think it ended up in a place that they did not expect. And when we think of an October surprise, we tend to think of something that we did not see coming that shifted things in a hurry. And I would say the insults to the Hispanic community, and then the next day,
The explanation.
well, the explanation.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. It's not funny, but it's
But then the next
horrifying,
day,
but
the
it's funny.
attack on CNN of Mehdi Hassan
Yeah.
has alienated the Arab population. And I think
We should explain it. For those of you that don't know, a right-wing commentator got into an argument with Mehdi Hassan. I have debated Mehdi. He's pretty hard-edged.
he's tough, but he's smart and he's fair.
He's tough, he's smart, but he basically said, well, if you don't want to be called a Nazi, don't support Nazi things or something. And he said, it's like saying, just because I support the Palestinians, I'm a terrorist. He said, yeah, I hope your beeper doesn't explode. Yeah.
It was bad.
It was bad.
It was bad. And that was a game changer as well. If you all of a sudden there have been all kinds of endorsements of the Harris-Walz campaign from different Arab constituencies as well who had been holding back. So those two things were probably, I think, behind Trump's decision to hold the press conference this morning at Mar-a-Lago, to which he was more than an hour late. Even I can make it downstairs in an hour, just saying. And in which he never actually took questions from the press, but instead it felt to me like first of all, he said that I guess I should tell you this, there are terrible problems in Pennsylvania, although he did not specify what they were, clearly setting up this idea that the election was going to be stolen. But then he kind of went through his usual greatest hits and then very low energy and then just sort of wandered off.
Yeah.
So things feel very different all of a sudden, I think, since Madison Square Garden. But I've said that now since 2016.
Yeah. I've been railing for 2 months about, it's not an October surprise. I'm one of the people, and I'm pleased to say, I think my magazine has been on this, of like, has anybody watching these rallies? He's gone.
He's gone.
He's gone. It's Sharks and My Uncle and Batteries and Hannibal Lecter. And I really have been upset with, I think, how our editor-in-chief refers to it as a kind of a coherence bias. Like, you can't write the story that says he made no sense whatsoever. So you say, well, he mentioned taxes, but I think you're seeing that come apart now. Like, what's really been astonishing me, I'm seeing headlines in Politico, New York Times, AP, basically saying Trump holds unhinged rant. And my only regret is that should have been a year ago, but it's happening.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons Madison Square Garden was such a surprise, they've been trying to troll the Harris campaign. And I have to say, again, I'm going to give kudos to the Harris campaign. They refused to take the bait. No. He went out there and he did all these. The reason I was laughing about explanations, this is something else you may not have heard. Their excuse the next day was like, hey, we're sorry about the Puerto Rican joke, but we did tell him he couldn't take a joke where he was going to call Kamala Harris the C word.
Yeah.
They thought that was like exculpatory.
Right.
They thought that was like showed they were being responsible, and that's just funny. I've got a question here you and I are both going to dispense with quickly. Is it time to get rid of the Electoral College? Probably, but it's not going to happen in a week, so get on with it.
Well, I'm going to amend that a little bit. I'm going to go yes and say that if we can't go straight to getting rid of it, which we should, simply going back to it being representational the way it should have been all along, the way it was intended to be, would be at least a halfway step. And also we have to do something about the number of people in the Electoral College. It was always intended to be, the numbers were supposed to be commensurate with the 2 senators and the number of people in the House of Representatives per state. But in 1929, the House capped its membership in the House of Representatives, and what that has done is it's significantly depressed representation in large states. So what we've got right now is, it's simply unwieldy. Weirdly, I reread the Constitutional Convention notes a week or two ago, and they were all over the Electoral College. The idea was they wanted to set up something that could not be influenced either by the president or by the Congress. So they created this group of people who would sort of parachute in. They're not allowed to be office holders. Parachute in, come up with a decision, and disperse again, which is a lovely thought. I get what they were doing, but boy, that sucker's out of date.
I think the thing you could do right away, and it wouldn't be that hard, enlarge the Congress. Congress hasn't been enlarged since 1913.
No, that's right. We would have more, 29. We would have more than 1,000 people in the House of Representatives.
You're the historian now? You're going to correct my date?
I couldn't let it go.
1929, I'm sorry.
I couldn't let it go.
Yep.
We would have over 1,000 people in the House of Representatives. But you know, even if you didn't want to get into that, you could put the numbers into the Electoral College without, I mean, that needs to be fixed too. But we could just get rid of it and cut to the chase, just saying.
But none of that is going to happen in 6 days. So you've got to win the game with the rules you're playing right now.
That's right.
Sorry. This is interesting. If Trump is reelected, and I think this was aimed at me because of the Daily, but I'm going to ask you too, because your Substack is one of the most popular in this part of the solar system. If Trump is reelected, are you concerned that you may be a target of his retribution?
I'm going to leave that one to you.
I don't think I'm that important. I think he will go after institutions. So do I think that magazines and newspapers, I mean, there's a reason that 3 newspapers just took a whiff on
we disagree about this one.
Endorsing.
But I'm going to say something different. I think that the first thing that an authoritarian does is erases the political opposition. Because until you get rid of the political opposition, you can't put in place all of the things you want to do. So I actually think a lot of people are going to be in danger.
They asked me, this was, are you personally concerned that you and I, me, you know, I don't, I know that I wrote something once that really annoyed him. Because he attacked it. I'll tell you. He attacked the Atlantic the morning after I published an article called Donald Trump, the Most Unmanly President.
So I must have read
like
it because I read everything that Tom writes, but I'm thinking, is this when you talked about the makeup, or is this when you talked about the...
Actually, the question I posed was, I come from a working class family. My parents were Depression-era high school dropouts, blue collar. My dad, you know, worked his way up to gray collar in a factory. My mom had a 9th grade education. So I grew up in a Western Massachusetts factory town that you in Western Pennsylvania would recognize as kind of like around here. And I said, why is it that working class men, the men I grew up around, whose handshake meant something, your word is your bond, you don't talk too much, you know, you keep an economy of words, you take care of your family, you respect women. Why do these guys love this guy who, you know, screws his workers, cakes on the makeup, wears bling, watches daytime TV, whines all day? And I said, why is it that this, you know, this is a very unnatural, I got a lot of hate mail about it.
Why do you think, do you have an answer?
I think they get that he's terrible, but they are so, and this actually relates to another question that someone said, what makes Americans so susceptible to be convinced to vote against their own interest? It's because they are dissatisfied with their own lives. It's because they are bored and aimless, and they just want to hurt other people. They don't really care about him or his policies. If tomorrow Trump became completely like a standard issue Republican, I think he'd lose half of MAGA. What they love about him is that and I just wrote a piece about this like 2 days ago, they love that he's transgressive because they want you to be uncomfortable when he's elected. And the worse he is, the more uncomfortable you'll be, and they like that. They want, because they feel like they've been wronged. They have this sense of grievance. And remember, he said this, I am your vengeance, I am your retribution. And so I think that they just, and also I think some men gravitated to him because he mimics tough guy behavior. You know, he talks about, he growls and he, you know, calls women names and talks about the, you know, dogs and all that stuff. And you know, that act works on some people. They don't recognize it as the insecurity of an aging bully. They think it really is manly. So I think it's just sad.
So to go back, though, now to something we started with, you were talking about the invisible Trump voters in 2016. And I would argue that the people who voted for Trump in 2016, many of them have left him by 2024. In part because in 2016, some of the invisible Trumpers were people who were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and they wanted to put in place a protest vote. And then he won. And they were like, this isn't actually what I wanted, and they were dead set against him by 2020. And now, of course, the real base are the people that you were talking about. But he has left those people behind. I think that protest vote was not small.
The Trumpers I'm talking about now, that is the 2024 vote.
Right.
They were always there. But you're right. There were people in 2016, friends of mine, who said, look, I can't vote for Hillary Clinton.
And she's going to win anyway.
So
I'm going to vote
also,
for Trump.
If he wins, he'll just shake things up. It's all an act. We'll get something different. They didn't expect what happened. And I think that you're right. They're gone now. Yeah. This is one for you, addressed to you. What is something you wish every American parent was telling their teenagers right now?
You know, that's, in a way, that's an easy one. You know, one of the things that people always ask me about is what's happening to American history curriculum, especially in places like Florida with the curriculum, which was actually not just history, it was social studies curriculum in Florida under Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, or what happened in Oklahoma with the curriculum that they have put in place there. And people look at that curriculum and they talk about how it has erased the Black experience in America. And believe me, I've read that curricula, and it's, you know, Asian Americans basically never arrived, and you know, Indigenous Americans, I think in the Florida curriculum, I think Chickasaws show up once, as I recall. You know, if you're looking at it right now, you know, don't check me on that. But the point is that marginalized peoples have been erased from that curriculum, and that is really what people tend to focus on. But if you read it, you will discover what has really been erased is agency. They have erased all the ways in which students learn how that they can have control over their lives, especially politically. There is, for example, Rosa Parks in Florida, but there is not the NAACP. There is not the civil rights movement. And so if I were going to say one thing to young people, it is that you have agency to change this world. And if you are willing to step up and take control of that agency, you can do anything. And that's something that I think Americans have had to unlearn. You know, really, for many reasons, I think since the 1980s, our society has been geared toward the idea that there is a great hero coming to save us all. And the truth is that I think since the arrival of Trump, a number of us who perhaps had waited to see what was going to happen to us, or waiting for someone to come save us, have discovered that we are the heroes we need. And that is something that young people must know going forward, so that they get engaged and they participate as well. So that's what I would say to young people.
And related to that, I think, you know, there's a writer at Columbia named Mark Lilla who said this is part of the problem is that the Democrats in particular have had the president as kind of daddy. If you just elect the right president, he's just going to fix everything. And that does take agency away from people. It just says, you know, show up every 4 years, vote for the right guy, and then you can get on with whatever. And it doesn't work that way.
I remember you saying when we were talking in Boston that Republicans voted the whole way down the ticket, right down to the local dog catcher, and the Democrats are like, I'll vote for the president and I'll be done. And actually, in political science, that's referred to as roll off. So that the Republicans believe that they have done their duty when they have voted the entire way down the ticket, while Democrats believe they've done their civic duty when they have voted for the races that they have personally investigated. So they have very high roll-off, and you don't get the whole down ballot. And one of the things that I've always said to people who are organizing in this particular election, unlearn that behavior right now. Vote the entire way down the ticket
and come back and.
Yeah.
And come back in 2 years for the state legislature. You know,
right.
I mean,
just so important. And the state judges, the state Supreme Court. I mean, all of it.
You know, when the Republicans said, well, we're not banning abortion, we're just giving it back to the states. Well, Kansas and other places said, okay, challenge accepted.
Right.
But that means that you have to vote for state legislators and state courts and all that stuff. You can't just assume that
And you got to fight gerrymandering.
Yeah. Speaking of which, this question is, what do you think of the future of the Supreme Court? After you, ma'am.
This just turned into Jeopardy over here. He's got all the questions, right?
I'll take horrific alternatives for 400, Alex.
Well,
I am actually a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion, by the way.
I had forgotten that. So that's how he ended up with the questions. So it depends on who's elected, because there are a number of problems with all the mechanics of our democracy, which we have let fall into disrepair and that are going to have to be repaired in the next decade or so in order to maintain our democracy. And the Supreme Court has a lot of problems. It doesn't just have the problem of the 3 justices that Donald Trump appointed. It has the problem of the fact that it has 9 justices on it when there are 13 districts. I mean, it hasn't been increased in size since 1869 under U.S. grant. And, you know, we've grown a little bit since then. But in addition to the structural problems with the court, there is also, I think, the quite big problem that we have a number of people sitting on that court right now who are severely compromised. And I would really like to see extraordinary pressure on at least 3 of them to step down. And you know I'm talking about Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh. And if Trump is elected, I think, I worry about more than just what he will appoint to the court. I worry about the fact that the respect for the Supreme Court will never recover. And that messes up the entire idea of 3 branches of government, which we could move around. We could have a long debate now about the Judicial Act of 1789, but you know, the Supreme Court took upon itself the right to review legislation. That is not in the Constitution, and we could revisit that. But when I think about the unsettling that would bring to our society, in a moment when we are already so unsettled, I would be much happier if we could restore the respect for the Supreme Court that it has not always, but usually enjoyed in our history.
Old school conservatives conserve. We don't like to change anything. We don't like to change things fast. We're the guys that buy our idea of buying a new car is to buy the same car in a different color, right? But I will say 2 things. First, the politicizing of the court, what finally triggered I kind of had a trial separation from the Republicans because of the 2012 election and particularly Newt Gingrich's behavior. So I was kind of like feeling a little disaffected. What really pushed me out was Susan, and it's strange, right? Because this doesn't seem like a big thing, but it was a big thing to me, was Susan Collins giving us all this Sunday school lecture about how awesome Brett Kavanaugh was. And I thought Brett Kavanaugh, temperamentally, I didn't reach a judgment about the accusations against him. I watched him and I said, temperamentally, this guy does not belong in the Supreme Court. He's a political animal. He's going to want revenge. He's going to be like Thomas. He's going to want payback for the way he thinks he was wronged. And that was it for me. I said, there is no moderate wing of the Republican Party anymore. What really has shocked me and what has shaken me to my core is the ruling in Trump v. U.S.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I've said this is the most important thing that's happened in the U.S. government since the beginning. Because it overturned the principles of American democracy that nobody is above the law.
Right.
And I'm shocked at how little attention that's gotten.
Well, I mean, Trump v. United States is just such an appalling decision. And we're not lawyers, but we are citizens of the United States. We have, eyes that see and know that the president cannot, this whole smokescreen about if it's an official act and it's limited immunity and a presumption. What 6 justices said is this guy is never going to answer for the things he did, and we're just not going to let you do it.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was crossing, there have always been justices that wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of was at one point said, oh, it's not a great decision, the way it was reasoned, doesn't want to get rid of it, but there are a lot of people that were critical of Roe v. Wade. There are a lot of people that have been critical about, Chevron, for example. I mean, there are good arguments to be made. Trump v. U.S. was a nakedly political decision that has changed the fundamental character of American democracy. And I don't know what to do about it because, again, as you say, if Trump wins, pray for the health of the other Supreme Court justices because he will, that's the other thing I should add is...
People will cease to listen to what the Supreme Court says.
Trump will cease. Trump will never listen to what the Supreme Court says unless it's in his favor.
Right.
But the problem is that the rule of law still obtains around this country, and the Supreme Court can order things that other units of the government will have to obey unless basically the whole government falls apart.
But this is one of the things that I think we perhaps don't pay enough attention to with Trump v. U.S., and that is that the Supreme Court did not say that the president is immune from everything. It says he's immune for official acts, but since we've never decided this before, the courts are going to be the ones who get to decide what is an official act. So you read this all the time. People say, well, why doesn't Biden just go off and do whatever he wants to do because the court said he could? And the answer is the court didn't say that. The court said it would decide what the president could do and what the president could not do. And the reason I think that is so significant is because if you think back to when Mitch McConnell became Senate Minority Leader in 2007, he pretty clearly decided that the Congress was no longer going to make laws, that he was going to weaponize the filibuster so that you couldn't get anything through the Congress, and instead of actually making laws and compromising and having people represented by their Congress, by the legislative branch of government, that in fact they would get the courts to make the laws by throwing cases in front of hand-picked judges who would hand down the kinds of decisions that McConnell wanted, that would get rid of regulations, that would get rid of the kind of New Deal government that had provided the kind of protections that people like McConnell didn't want to have any longer. And I look at that as really a judicial coup, and deeply troubling when you have the idea that Donald Trump could continue it, not only at the Supreme Court level, but also through the federal courts, because you get Matthew Kaczmarek in Texas, where people are judge shopping to get him to hand down the decisions he wants. He's the one who tried to get mifepristone declared that it shouldn't have gone through the Food and Drug Administration, and that would have banned its use across the entire country. You can judge shop across this country and get any government you want if you get to choose the judges.
The irony, too, in this, with what McConnell did, is that when I was a young Republican back then, one of the biggest arguments that conservatives made against liberals is that you guys were trying to kick everything to activist judges to short-circuit the legislative process.
Yeah, and the activist judges were activists because they were actually using the 14th Amendment the way it was designed to be used.
But it's almost like they
which
said,
is in the Constitution.
Hey, we made this accusation for years. Why don't we just do it?
Yeah, that's right.
It's remarkable. I mean, it is. And I took a lot of static from some of my former comrades on the right when I said, this court is an activist court. And they're like, no, they're just, again, they're just kicking it back to the state. No, this is an activist court. And particularly those, Thomas and Alito, I mean, I think they're ruling as basically wannabe theocrats at this point.
Right.
That the Constitution, I think that there's almost like a certain amount of regret that the First Amendment still separates church and state there. Here's a ringer question that's, I think, meant to provoke us both, but especially you. What does the fact that half of the country is pro-Trump, despite his flaws, say about how unappealing the Democrats are?
You know what it says? I think it says that we have a profound problem with information access in this country. Because we know that when when people are presented with policy positions without them being identified as Republican or Democrat, that the Democratic positions are extraordinarily popular. We have more than 80% of people who want common sense gun safety legislation in this country. We have 63% of people who want Roe v. Wade to be codified into law. And I could keep on going down this list. But what I have seen is, since the rise of talk radio in 1987 well, I'm going to say the fairness doctrine, even though I know I know the arguments against that, and I agree with them, that in fact it only covered things that had broadcast licenses, but that was AM radio. And that's where we get talk radio.
I'll make a quick amendment and say what I think really created the talk radio problem was a stealth move that allowed corporations to own several stations across markets.
What year was that?
It was in the mid '80s. I can't, but that's how, I'm sorry. This is to me the fairness doctrine is always this like trigger for me, because there was conservative talk radio before then, but what you couldn't do was put it on 100 stations across the country, right. And that was what Limbaugh really benefited from with that regulatory change, and I can't remember the name of it, but I interrupted you, and I'm very sorry.
No, I think that's right, that you get Limbaugh, who did not actually start as a political shock jock. He started as a shock jock because the FM radio was really taking off, and AM radio was sort of dead airspace, and people were looking at a way to get ears onto AM radio, and it ended up being shock jocks in general, but political shock jocks like Limbaugh. But with the rise of talk radio and then the rise of the Fox News channel in 1996, which was always an entertainment channel, and then the death of local newspapers and the rise of, for example, Sinclair, and the blanketing now of talk radio in news deserts, which is really notable if you drive across this country. It's always easy to get a talk radio station. It is not easy to get literally anything else. I think what you're seeing is not that the Democrats are unattractive. I think what you're seeing is we have an entire large part of this country that is operating in a world that is a world based in a fantasy, and that is a deliberate political move to destabilize democracy. There's a political theory behind this. It's called virtual politics or political technology, where you create a false world and convince people to vote against democracy. Maybe on little issues they might agree with it, but to vote against democracy is how you destabilize countries, and that clearly has been at work in the United States, and it still is.
You were nicer than I was. I would have taken issue. I would have taken issue with the premise of the question. I don't think half the country is pro-Trump because the Democrats are unappealing. I think half the country is just mindlessly tribalist. And it doesn't matter who the opponent is. That it's a sense of belonging. It's a team mentality that says, I'm on Team Republican, and by definition, I have to make the other team the bad guys because I want to belong. I want to be part of something. I think you see this with Trump rallies. You see this with the Trumpers that get interviewed, in all their regalia and bling and all that stuff. They're having the time of their lives. They're part of something. And demonizing Democrats is just part of that. Now, everything Heather just said is true because there's a whole ecosystem in the media that services that and generates it and sharpens it to the point where people, we talked about this when we were kind of planning out what we were going to do out here. And I find that I don't know how to talk to some people about this because, I'm like, yeah, okay, there are some Democrats that are kind of out there on the edge and they make mistakes. And sure, they make fodder for somebody like Sean Hannity. But holy crap, they're not, do you understand what a communist is? They're communists. I'm like, when I was a kid in the Cold War, calling somebody a communist was like, those are fighting words. And people now say, well, they're Marxist, fascist, communist, socialist. To me, what I hear is, I need to belong to my team. I'm lonely. I think one thing we haven't talked about, because neither of us is sociologists and there's a lot of work to be done on this, I think a lot of the Trump movement rose out of an epidemic, not just of narcissism that I've written about, but I think it rose out of a gigantic epidemic of loneliness in this country. And that, That loneliness was serviced exactly by talk radio and by Fox and the people who said, we're your friends, we're here for you, we're connecting with you, you're we're going to reveal the conspiracies to you. And I think we've really underestimated the degree to which, especially in these news deserts, that it becomes, we will give your life some meaning and structure by doing all this, and by getting you to believe things that, again, I can't even have conversations with people who say things. I'll give you one example and we'll move to the last question, because the last question is important. A friend of mine said to me in 2016, Tom, we got to do something. The economy's I'm like, the economy's not terrible. This drives me crazy about now. Like, what's Kamala Harris going to do about the economy? Could it, inflation's 2.4%. I'm sorry, like, my God, communism, But he said to me, yeah, but what if, because Trump was saying things like unemployment is 40%. He said, what if unemployment really is 40%? I said, as your friend, I swear to you on my life that it's not 40%. I said, it wasn't 40% during the Great Depression. It was only 25%. But this is the part that scared me. He nodded and he said, okay, but what if I feel like it is? And I won't tell you what I said, but it involved an F-bomb about his feelings.
Well,
okay,
but let me push back not push back, but amend what you just said, in that I do think that there's a sense of community at a Trump rally and a sense of community among the people who go to a Trump rally. And one of the things that political scientists, did to us in the 1960s was they convinced Republicans and Democrats both, real Republicans and Democrats both, that people all agreed on democracy, so you shouldn't keep talking about that anymore. Yeah. And one of the things that I have seen in the last, 5 years is when I've been paying daily attention, but I've seen in the last numbers of years, is that those of us who care about democracy and who care about people being treated equally before the law and the protection of our vote are also a community. If you come to anything that I do, you will see people in lines, chatting and like exchanging recipes. And there is the only reason that those Trump people are feeling like that is their community is, I think, because they have now been in that constructed bubble to believe that is the only community and that we are the enemy. Because you know what? I've been all over this country for 13 months now. Americans are decent people. They are nice people. They are welcoming people. And you have to work to feel that they are your enemy. And you have to be told that they are your enemies. So this reconstruction of a more not more welcoming, because I don't think that people like me are unwelcoming to people who found their solace in the Trump rallies. But to reinforce the idea that you can have a community and your vote can matter. And I think people want to believe that they're doing something important. And a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th thought they were doing something really important. They were protecting American democracy. But they believed that because of what they had been told.
We're almost at time, so we're going to end with this. I'm going to combine two questions together. Do you see signs of hope for our democracy? And what do we do if he wins? And then in parentheses, help.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. The hopeful sign for democracy, there are two of them. One is, Heather's already said it. We are a decent people. We are good people. We're going through a bad time. A lot of our brothers and sisters and fellow citizens have fallen into a very bad environment, that I think will pass if we can survive this long enough to get past it. The other thing is a more wonky answer, which is federalism, which is that, even if Trump wins, you know what? The people of Pennsylvania, the people of the state of Rhode Island, where I live, we're small, but we're fierce. The several states of this union can still decide how their citizens live. We have constitutions. We have laws. We have communities and norms. We don't have to simply say, well, some Some fascist got elected president. I guess that's how it is in America now. No, that's not how it is in America. And if we keep true to those principles, that doesn't have to be how it is much beyond Pennsylvania Avenue. That's what I think.
I like that. So I obviously have hope. I keep saying to people, I would not write every freaking morning until 3 o'clock for fun, like if I thought this was not going anywhere. And the reason that I have hope is because of you all and people like you across the country, because I think people have woken up to how fragile our democracy is and that it is not a spectator sport, and they are putting in the effort to preserve it. And I always like to say to people, this moment looks so much to me like 1860. And they're not comfortable when I say that. And what I mean by that is that if you lived in America in 1853, it would look like the elite enslavers had gotten it all. They had the Senate, they had the White House, and they had the Supreme Court. And the only place where those people who didn't want the spread of human enslavement to take over the country had power was in the House of Representatives. And in 1854, the elite enslavers pushed through the House of Representatives the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which overruled the Missouri Compromise and permitted human enslavement to move into the northern territories that had been protected by the Missouri Compromise. And what that meant is those western states, those western territories would become slave states, and those slave states in the West would work with the slave states in the South to overrule the northern states that wanted to protect the idea of free labor. So in 1854, it looked like the elite enslavers really had gotten it all. And after it became clear that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to pass through the House of Representatives, there's a meeting in Washington of 30 lawmakers. They meet in the rooms of Edward Dickinson of Massachusetts, whose daughter was a poet. It was literally Emily Dickinson's father. And they went into that room as Whigs and Democrats and Know-Nothings, that is the anti-immigrant party, and Free Soilers and as independents, and they looked at each other and said, listen, we disagree about immigration, we disagree about finance, we disagree about internal improvements, but by God, we can agree that we want to protect democracy against those oligarchs who are trying to take it over. They go back home after this meeting, because it's the summer break, and they start to spread this idea across the country, and they don't even have a name yet. They're the anti-Nebraska Party, and they sweep the polls in 1855 and in 1856. They take control of the House of Representatives. By 1859, Abraham Lincoln has joined them. He's a lawyer from Illinois who was slow to join what is by then known as the Republican Party. And he has articulated a new kind of American government, a government that is going to respond to ordinary people rather than to the need of the elite enslavers to protect their human property. By 1860, Americans had put him into the White House at a time when only white men could vote. By January of 1863, he has signed the Emancipation Proclamation, ending human enslavement in the lands that are controlled by the Confederacy. And by November of 1863, he has given the Gettysburg Address, which calls for the protection of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and calls for a new birth of freedom in America. In less than 10 years, the country had gone from the rich enslavers get it all to we're going to protect a government of ordinary Americans. And Abraham Lincoln did not do that himself. He did it thanks to the voters who put him in office and put people who could support him into offices, not only in Congress, but also in the state houses and the state legislatures across the North. And I think of that, and I think that if they could turn the United States around that profoundly in less than 10 years when only white men could vote, we sure as hell can do it now in 2024. And that's why I have hope.